One bullet. One breath. One chance. That was all I needed, and yet the galaxy laughed in my face. Thousands of alien soldiers roared with amusement as I stood in the middle of the colossal war coliseum, clutching what they called a primitive stick shooter. Their helmets shimmered with high-tech alloys, their weapons hummed with plasma energy, their drones hovered like hunting hawks. And there I was, a human from Earth, holding a rifle that ran on gunpowder. They called me caveman, relic, fossil. One soldier even asked if I planned to throw rocks when the bullets ran out. I smiled, not because I wasn't offended, but because I knew something they didn't. Physics doesn't care about who's laughing. The crowd's jeers echoed as the Galactic Overseer announced my trial. This was no ordinary training exercise. Each recruit had to prove themselves in the Colosseum, fighting simulated battles before an audience of generals, politicians, and betting spectators from 23 star systems. The aliens strutted with their weapons like walking arsenals, eager to show off laser precision and molecular blades. I just checked my rifle, chambered around, and felt the weight of the wooden stock press against my shoulder. They thought it was a museum piece. To me, it was the sharp edge of survival. My barracks introduction had already been humiliating. When I walked in, soldiers pointed at me as if I were part of the entertainment roster. One grinning reptilian leaned close and said, "Careful with that thing, you might poke someone's eye out." Another held his side laughing, claiming he could probably block my bullet with his finger. I didn't reply. I just gave them a half smile and kept polishing the barrel. The truth was, I knew exactly how fragile their shiny helmets really were. I had spent hours studying their design in secret, noticing micro-stress fractures and resonance points where kinetic force could travel like a spiderweb crack. But I wasn't about to share that. Let them laugh. The longer they mocked me, the less they would expect what came next. When my name was called, the holographic battlefield materialized around me, a shifting wasteland of jagged rocks, simulated fog, and scattered cover points. Across from me, 5 galactic soldiers posed dramatically with their shimmering energy rifles. The crowd cheered. Bets were already flashing on the massive display board above. The odds of me surviving a full minute were listed at 4%. 4%. A cockroach probably had better numbers. I settled behind a rock, adjusted the scope, and let their insults fuel my calm. The start signal boomed and plasma fire lit up the air like fireworks. Bolts hissed and sizzled against cover as my opponents advanced, taunting me with exaggerated dance moves in their gleaming armor. The crowd howled with laughter. I exhaled slowly, counting heartbeats. The trigger pulled back with the gentlest pressure, and the world snapped into silence as the shot fired. The bullet cracked out, cutting through the haze, ricocheting off a jagged metal wall with a sound like a whip, and slammed directly into the edge of a commander's helmet. Sparks flew. The helmet didn't shatter, but something more dangerous happened. A fine crack etched across the visor like a spreading spider web. The laughter faltered. Soldiers blinked, confused. The commander froze, touching his helmet as if he couldn't believe it. The crowd's roar quieted into a ripple of murmurs. Then I spoke, just loud enough for the microphone to catch it. Physics doesn't care about your ego. The silence that followed was more satisfying than a standing ovation. The overseer's eyes narrowed, realizing what none of the others yet understood. My so-called toy weapon had just exposed a weakness their advanced engineers hadn't accounted for. Of course, the other soldiers didn't give up mocking me. They doubled down. One of them shouted, "Lucky shot, caveman." Another banged on his helmet to prove it was unbreakable. But I saw it, the tiny tremor of uncertainty in their movements, the way their fingers lingered near their visors as if suddenly aware that their greatest symbol of superiority might not be invincible. That was all I needed. Doubt is a sharper weapon than any blade. When the match ended, the officials tried to dismiss it as an accident, a fluke of ricochet physics. But the seed was planted. The next day in the mess hall, soldiers who had mocked me now stared longer than they meant to. A few even avoided eye contact. Still, others thought it was hilarious to prank me. They swapped my ammunition for paint-filled capsules, turned my bunk into a collapsing joke bed, and even piped alien lullabies into my quarters at maximum volume. I laughed it off, but I also studied them, watched the way their armor flexed, listened to the buzz of their plasma weapons overheating, and logged every detail. Humiliation can be a teacher if you let it. I knew better than to think I had earned their respect. The galaxy didn't work that way. Respect wasn't given to humans anymore. Earth was considered a backwater planet, a curiosity at best, an embarrassment at worst. My presence in the Galactic Army was more spectacle than strategy, a way to keep the crowds entertained. But I hadn't come here to be laughed at. I came because I wanted to prove that Earth still mattered. I wanted to show them that our so-called primitive tools carried an elegance their machines had forgotten. A bullet may be small, but in the right hands, it could break a world open. That night, alone in my bunk, I disassembled the rifle and cleaned it piece by piece. Each metallic click echoed like a heartbeat in the quiet. I thought of my father back on Earth, teaching me how to steady my breath before squeezing the trigger, whispering that the world narrows down to the space between you and the target. He had died with no recognition, just another forgotten soldier in a forgotten war. Maybe this was my chance to give Earth a voice again, one shot at a time. My fingers tightened on the stock as I reassembled the rifle, and I promised myself I wouldn't waste that chance. By the next trial round, the laughter had grown louder than ever. They were convinced I was nothing but comic relief. But I didn't mind. The more they laughed, the more they revealed their blind spots. I saw arrogance in their posture, overconfidence in their aim, and a dangerous ignorance in their trust in technology. I smiled, loading a single round, and muttered under my breath. One bullet. One breath. One chance. And somewhere deep inside, I knew the galaxy wasn't ready for what came next. They laughed me out of the barracks before sunrise, and I let them, because on mornings like that laughter was a smoke screen and I preferred to move under cover. The corridors smelled of synthetic citrus and hot wiring, the common scent of ships that had never touched soil. Every step echoed with metal certainty. A pair of insected soldiers with mirror chitin clicked past, performing an exaggerated limp as if parodying the way a human walks. Behind them a scaled giant from the rim worlds cradled his plasma cannon like a child. He announced to the hallway that the museum had lost a rifle and a caveman. The squad around him howled. I kept moving, eyes forward, carrying my so-called stick shooter and a face that said nothing at all. My throat was tight, but not with shame. It was focus, a knot I had learned to tie and keep tied. At breakfast the pranks began. My tray slid down the line, and when I lifted my cup, steam rose in a pretty spiral from a liquid that looked like coffee but tasted like melted soap. Someone behind me cackled. A drone looped the mess hall, projecting a cartoon of a primitive hunter squinting down a bone tube. The more they laughed, the more ordinary it became, and the more invisible I felt. That was useful. I chewed the rubbery protein, sipped the soap, and studied helmets. The mess hall held every model from every branch. Crystal visors, organic weaves grown in tanks, reflective alloys that turned faces into pale moons. The owners tilted their heads, chatted, mocked, yawned. Hidden hinges flexed. Vents opened, closed, opened again. In those tiny movements, in the rhythm of breath against barrier, I saw what I had begun to suspect in the arena. These masterpieces of engineering had been designed to defeat energy. They had not been asked to survive old-fashioned force in very specific patterns. After breakfast my bunk collapsed like a theatrical stage prop. I hit the floor with a grunt and stared up at the sagging frame. Applause erupted from the doorway. The saboteur was a lanky soldier with copper skin and a humor that relied entirely on gravity. He promised to fix it after he won the weekly obstacle run. The others drifted out, still chuckling. I stood, dusted myself off, and examined the bolts at the bed corners. Not a bad job. Reversible. Precise. I tightened them, then sat and let the silence gather. A person can be humiliated and still learn. The trick is to harvest information while the blood is still hot in your cheeks. Training that day was a parade of small humiliations explained as safety checks. My ammo locker had been swapped with a crate of paint rounds, milky spheres that would burst on impact and make any shot a joke. The armorer shrugged when I asked for the real thing and told me to lighten up. The drill sergeant assigned me a spot at the far end of the range where the ventilation was broken and the air tasted like burnt plastic. Every few minutes a set of recruits took turns firing at targets that danced and flickered with advanced algorithms. Their energy bolts left luminous scars in the air. I loaded a paint round, fired, and watched the sphere wobble toward a metal plate, burst, and slide down like a tear. The nearest group cackled. I asked for permission to adjust my optics. Granted, came the bored reply. While I adjusted, I counted the milliseconds between vent rattles, the way the metal plate rang when hit by an energy burst, the decay of the tone. Resonance tells the biography of a surface. It tells what it fears. I caught the eye of the range supervisor and asked to measure the plate thickness. He laughed as if I were doing performance art, but waved me on. I ran gloved fingers along the edges and found tiny notches for mounting. The plate had been swapped many times, which meant the mounting hardware was standardized, which meant I could replicate conditions later. Back on my lane, I twisted the scope ring and dialed a distance that made no sense for a paint round, then aimed at the top left mounting corner, not the bullseye. Shot, ricochet, slap, smear. The paint traced a line that anyone would dismiss as random. To me, it was a mirrored path of stress. The mockers were busy filming the bright recruits with their grenades and throwing knives. No one bothered to film the Earthman missing on purpose. Lunch brought the next joke. A tray delivered by drone slid in front of me with a flourish. The protein block was carved into the shape of a little rifle. The table erupted in mirth. I lifted the fork, tasted the block, and nodded. Edible. While they watched for a reaction, I watched their helmets when they laughed. Every helmet has a laugh posture. Some tilt back. Some crack along hidden seams to admit more air. Some widen at the jaw, tiny flexes that could become fault lines if induced with just the right vibration. The revelation settled in quietly, like a bead of water finding a groove. Energy-resistant materials disperse heat and convert it. Kinetic microshocks, however, ridden at resonant frequencies, can pass through like a whisper that turns into a shout at the perfect pitch. The arena shot had not been a miracle. It had been the edge of a map. In the afternoon we ran a capture drill in the ventilation deck, a labyrinth of ducts and service scaffolds above the engineering bay. The drill paired me with a trio of swaggering soldiers whose confidence could have been bottled and sold as a solvent. The objective was simple on paper. Reach the flag in the center. In practice it meant ambush, noise, sweat, nerves. The trio dashed ahead, firing plasma bursts at shadows for the thrill of it. I slowed, listened, took in the metallic chorus. Air thrummed through ducts. Fans thudded a heartbeat tempo. Somewhere a valve groaned on a failing seal. I climbed into a narrow conduit and crawled toward the sound, not because it led to the flag but because it led to a corner of the map most competitors ignored. From that corner I could see 3 routes converge. When opponents raced through, I tapped the duct with the butt of the rifle, a polite knock. It created a tiny pressure wave, nudging 2 helmets to turn at once. Their visors flashed. My team leaped, captured, celebrated. They credited luck. I credited physics for her generosity. The alarms woke us before dawn, a shrieking chorus that rattled the barracks and made the metal walls seem alive with panic. Soldiers bolted upright, helmets clattering to the floor as the lights blazed crimson. The overhead announcer declared that this was not a drill. The words froze even the veterans mid-stride. No one believed the hive would strike so soon, not here, not on a fortified outpost surrounded by fleets. Yet the screens above the doorways showed the truth in brutal clarity. Swarms of living ships blotting out stars, black wings stretching across vacuum, psychic pulses registering as storms on every sensor. The Zytherian hive had arrived, and they were already breaking through the perimeter. Chaos rippled through the ranks. Plasma rifles were checked, drones whirred to life, and soldiers barked nervous jokes that failed to land. I should have been terrified. Instead I felt something else, a strange calm that filled the space where fear should have lived. I tightened the strap on my rifle case and muttered to myself, one bullet, one breath, one chance. Around me, alien recruits fumbled with gear, their mockery replaced with wide-eyed dread. The swagger that had filled the halls yesterday drained out of them like water from a cracked tank. Suddenly, no one cared if I was a caveman or a clown. We were all just bodies about to be tested by something far older and hungrier than pride. Deployment orders rang through the speakers, and squads poured into the hangar bay. The air vibrated with engines and shouted commands. Outside, the force shield shimmered as fighter wings streaked past, some already burning. The hive did not come like an army with lines and ranks. They came like a living storm, fragments of themselves peeling away to form new weapons mid-flight, psychic shrieks reverberating through the hull. The veterans whispered prayers in tongues I did not know. I checked my scope, adjusted for drift, and walked toward the loading ramp as if this were nothing more than another training day. A reptilian officer stared at me with disbelief and finally blurted out, "You think that stick of yours will matter?" I just smiled and answered, "We'll see if physics picks a side today." Our transport shook as we descended into the war zone. Explosions rippled through the atmosphere, painting the clouds with unnatural fire. The hive dropped their warriors directly from their ships, living missiles that struck the ground and unfolded into towering insected killers. They moved like a tide, armored shells glistening, mandibles gnashing, their psychic wails hammering against helmets and skulls alike. Plasma bolts carved glowing lines through their ranks, but for every one that fell, 2 more replaced it. Soldiers around me screamed, cursed, fired wildly. My ears tuned most of it out. I had eyes only for the helmets, the visors, the arrogance that was about to become vulnerability. We hit ground hard, the ramp slamming open to a world already on fire. Dust, smoke, and alien ichor filled the air. My squad scattered, taking positions behind jagged rock and collapsed structures. Plasma fire hissed in every direction. The hive advanced without hesitation, their armored forms shrugging off energy blasts, their claws slicing through defenses. I dropped prone, steadied my rifle, and let the chaos narrow into silence. Heartbeats slowed, breath aligned, scope clear. A hive warrior towered above the battlefield, its helmet like a twisted skull fused with crystal. I tracked its stride, aimed at the edge where visor met shell, and squeezed. The bullet cracked out, struck, and the visor fractured in a delicate spider web. The alien froze, stunned. A second later its head imploded as the fracture spread inward. The nearby soldiers gasped. The alien collapsed. Silence swept across that corner of the battle. Then someone whispered, "He did it again." The next shot came quicker. Another hive general rose, barking psychic commands that made lesser soldiers tremble. I lined up, let the shot ricochet once off a rusted beam, and the bullet kissed the helmet at just the right angle. A crack, then a bloom of shattering glass. The alien staggered, disoriented, and fell to its knees. Plasma fire from nearby soldiers finished it, but the truth was clear. My rifle had opened the door. The mocking laughter of days past was gone. Soldiers who had jeered now stared with awe, disbelief melting into desperate hope. A single human sniper had found a weakness where their entire arsenal had failed. The battle raged, each moment a gamble of survival. My shots rang out one by one, each deliberate, each a question posed to the hive armor. The answers came in cracks and splinters. The more helmets fractured, the more soldiers rallied. They began to cluster around me, covering my flanks as if my rifle were a banner to follow. Plasma squads formed firing lines at my command, though no one had ever given me authority. I called out targets, instructed angles, and they obeyed. For a moment the battlefield shifted, momentum bending. We were no longer a collapsing defense. We were something the hive had not planned for. We were a wall with a crack in their armor. By morning the smoke over the outpost had settled into a dirty halo that made the sun look like a lantern behind frosted glass. Repairs thrummed through every corridor, a mechanical heartbeat that said we had survived but not by much. The debrief should have been a victory parade, but the faces around the table were too tired to celebrate. Eyes were red-rimmed. Armor carried new dents like tattoos. The brass tried to flatten it all into bullet points while the mess crew brewed coffee that tasted like ambition diluted with despair. They wanted to quantify what had happened. They wanted a chart for how a human relic had turned helmets into eggshells. The engineers argued about composites and vibrational harmonics while I sat quietly and rolled a pencil between my fingers, thinking of the girder that had sung to me in the middle of a battlefield. The orders came down quickly. I was to be attached temporarily to a strike unit designated for forward reconnaissance, a fancy way of saying we will send you where the dying tends to be most educational. The officer in charge was the midnight armored watcher from the washroom. He introduced himself as Commander Varick with the flat calm of a man who had already outlived 3 careers. He did not smile. He did not sneer. He simply looked at my case and asked what I needed. I told him I needed sight lines, surfaces that ring, and 2 teammates who can keep me alive without asking me to explain physics while I am counting my heartbeats. He nodded once and assigned me a heavy infantryman named Hawks with a cannon as long as my leg and a scout named Lynn whose eyes measured distance with the same quiet accuracy I prized. A good triangle, Varick said. Points and base. We deployed before noon to a ravine that the hive had been using as a supply throat. The approach was a maze of slagged vehicles and fallen pylons, perfect for ambush, and it gnawed on my nerves in a healthy way. Hawks moved with surprising grace for a walking fortress, his footsteps careful where you would expect thunder. Lynn flowed ahead of us like a rumor, marking routes with the kind of brevity that keeps you alive, a flicked hand, a single word, a breath held then released. Above, the sky was a pale bruise. Below, the ground whispered old heat. The first contact came as a chittering echo that grew into a waterfall of bodies. Hive drones spilled over the edge like an avalanche with knives. Hawks braced, Lynn vanished into shadow, and I took a knee behind a boulder that had the right bones for singing. The first shot cracked into the stone and skipped into a drone helm with a small clean note. The visor webbed and the creature collapsed, its limbs twitching to a rhythm that no longer had a conductor. Hawks barked delighted disbelief and drew a line of plasma that turned the next wave into a field of sparking shells. Lynn popped from cover to paint a path across the ridge with short, sharp bursts that made the drones hesitate just long enough for my second shot to find the joint of a commander helm, the seam where design meets compromise. It fractured like ice in spring. For a brief span of minutes we owned that ravine. Helmets failed under the old grammar of impact and echo. Our little triangle breathed in time, the kind of synchronization that never shows on a report because it lives in the lungs and the soles of your feet. I remembered what it felt like to be on a team back on Earth long before I was a prop for laughter. Then the hive changed the key. A new group advanced behind the drones, larger and slower, their helmets swollen with fresh bone, ridge lines thicker, visors recessed under jutting brows. They had learned in a day what some militaries failed to learn in a century. Their approach was an insult to pride. It said, "We are not impressed by your cleverness." I felt annoyance flash through the calm and let it pass like a gust across a pond. Pride is a slippery companion when precision is required. I searched the terrain for instruments. A broken support strut lay half embedded in the slope, its interior honeycombed in a way that promised resonance if struck at exactly the right place. I angled the shot low, not at the enemies but at the strut, and the bullet walked the inner ribs with a sound I felt in my teeth. The note leaped into the lead helm and made it shiver visibly. The visor did not shatter. Instead, a fog crept across it, the sure sign of microfractures standing on the edge of surrender. Hawks saw it, and finished the job with a beam that slid through where rigidity had just quietly died. Lynn laughed once, a short silver sound, and said, "Keep the song going." We pushed forward by inches, measuring the ground not just in meters but in timbre and pitch. The hive pushed back with psychic pressure that felt like standing too close to a speaker at a concert where the music is made of teeth. My vision doubled, then righted. I tasted copper and refused to wipe the blood from my lip because any movement not aimed at survival was a luxury. Varick checked in over comms with steady questions whose purpose was obvious and welcome. He wanted to know whether this technique would scale if we had to move from ravines to city ruins. I said stone sings and steel hums and glass begs for mercy if you ask in exactly the right way. He said that would do. The outpost smelled of scorched metal and disinfectant, a scent that never left your lungs even after sleep. The halls buzzed with the sound of repair drones welding and medics barking orders at half-conscious soldiers. The hive had been pushed back for the moment, but everyone knew it was only a pause, not a victory. I spent the morning in the range, running simulations and practicing ricochets until the wood of my rifle stock felt slick under my palms. My shots sang against plates and walls, leaving trails of resonance that reminded me the hive would not stay vulnerable for long. I needed new answers, and I needed them before the next wave arrived. Word spread faster than plasma fire. Soldiers whispered about how the caveman had turned the hive into shattered glass, but whispers carried envy with them like thorns. Not everyone wanted the human sniper to be the story. One officer in particular, a decorated alien named Kelm, had always sneered from the sidelines. He was broad, metallic-skinned, and armed with a gravity cannon that could bend bone in half a mile. He considered himself untouchable, the pride of his unit, and he despised the attention shifting toward me. I caught him watching me in the mess hall, his jaw tightening each time someone muttered my name with awe instead of laughter. Resentment is quiet until it decides to sharpen itself. When the next deployment came, I discovered his blade had already struck. I opened my ammo case to find the familiar brass rounds replaced with hollow copies that collapsed under a fingernail. They would fire but disintegrate before reaching a target. In the middle of a battlefield, they would mean death, not just for me but for anyone relying on my shots. I said nothing. I closed the case and carried it to the transport, as if it held salvation instead of betrayal. Inside my chest anger curled, but anger is useless without direction. Physics cares nothing for envy, and I intended to make the laws of motion work for me regardless of sabotage. The battlefield was a shattered industrial zone, factories hollowed by age and then gutted further by hive claws. Towers leaned like broken teeth, and the air stank of acid and ozone. We took position on the roof of a half-collapsed refinery, while the hive advanced in swarms. Hawks and Lynn were with me, their eyes steady, their breaths calm. They had learned to move with my rhythm. I chambered one of the hollow rounds, aimed, and fired. The bullet disintegrated halfway to the target, a cloud of dust scattering in the air. Hawks swore under his breath. Lynn glanced at me sharply. I whispered, "Sabotage," and reached into my pack for the pieces I had hidden for emergencies. A few scavenged shards of hive chitin, a vial of their corrosive ichor, and stripped copper from a ruined circuit. I had been experimenting in private, searching for a way to combine the hive's own biology with the simplicity of lead. Now was the time to finish the recipe. As the hive closed in, I dipped around into the ichor and wrapped it with a thin spiral of copper wire, sealing the improvised hybrid with resin scraped from my kit. It was crude, ugly, and alive in a way bullets should not be. I loaded it carefully and whispered, "Let us see if you sing louder than steel." My scope locked on a hive elite pushing forward with a helmet ridged in grotesque curves. I pulled the trigger. The bullet cut through the air, and when it struck, the ichor hissed and spread like wildfire along the cracks I had calculated. The visor bubbled, the helmet sagged, and the elite fell thrashing. The explosion of ichor sent nearby drones stumbling. Even Hawks, who had seen me pull miracles from stone, let out a low whistle. Lynn muttered, "You have been busy." The hybrid round became the only answer we had in that fight. Each time I loaded one, the result was chaos in the hive's ranks. Their armor resisted plasma, but it could not resist its own corrupted biology turned against it. I worked quickly, dipping and sealing rounds while the sky burned with plasma fire. Hawks kept the swarm from overrunning us, his cannon blazing like a storm. Lynn moved through shadow, her shots surgical, her presence a whisper that guided me to the right target at the right time. Together we held, the three of us, not because of advanced technology but because desperation had forced invention. The hive, however, adapted again. Their queen herself appeared on the battlefield, rising from the heart of the swarm like a nightmare sculpted from bone and crystal. Her form was colossal, her helmet a jagged crown that pulsed with psychic energy. Soldiers faltered, some fleeing at the sight of her. The air thickened, each breath heavy as though we were drowning in invisible water. Even Hox's cannon faltered against her armor, beams scattering like rain against glass. Lynn whispered that it was hopeless. I told her no, that hopeless is just a word for physics we have not measured yet. I steadied the rifle, loading one of my last hybrid rounds. The Queen moved slowly, confident, her stride shaking the ruined ground. I measured everything: wind direction through the broken towers, the shifting gravity fields caused by her psychic pulse, the weakness in her stride that revealed the weight of her helm. I exhaled, slowed the world, and fired. The round flew true, dipping once as if bowing before its target. It struck the side of her visor. For a moment nothing happened. Then the ichor spread in branching veins, seeping into the grooves of her crown. Cracks bloomed like ice spreading across a frozen pond. The Queen staggered, her psychic scream fracturing the air itself. She clawed at her helm, but the fractures only deepened. The swarm faltered, drones collapsing as their link to her flickered. I did not have enough rounds to finish it. My sabotage had left me short, and the Hive Queen would recover unless the soldiers seized the moment. I shouted into the comms, "Her visor is breaking, focus fire now." For once, no one hesitated. Plasma, rockets, blades, and drones converged on her with desperate unity. The Queen roared, staggered, and finally collapsed under the weight of her own crumbling armor. The battlefield went quiet except for the sound of fire, and the ragged breaths of soldiers who had seen death and chosen not to lie down for it. When we returned to the outposts, the cheers were louder than any laughter had ever been. Soldiers clapped my back, some still smeared with blood, their voices hoarse from screaming victory. Count stood in the corner, his face sour, his envy now naked. Varric approached me, his visor reflecting the glow of the fires outside. He said, "Sabotage nearly killed you," and I nodded. He asked, "Do you want me to handle it?" I told him no. Physics would handle it eventually. Pride bends, just like metal, when it is struck at the right angle. That night I sat alone in the barracks, my rifle disassembled on the table, the ichor still staining my gloves. I thought of Earth, of the ranges where I had once practiced with ordinary rounds, of my father's quiet lessons. The galaxy did not care about Earth, but I did. And if one human with a rifle could shatter helmets and bring down queens, then perhaps Earth was not finished after all. I promised myself I would make more rounds, refine them, combine patience with science until even the Hive could no longer adapt. I had become more than the caveman with a gun. I had become the crack in their armor, the silence after their laughter, and I was not finished yet. The morning after the Queen fell, the outpost felt like a place that had remembered how to breathe. The smoke thinned and the sky regained its true color, a pale blue that looked almost fragile after so many days of ash. Repair crews moved with a quieter purpose, medics spoke in normal voices again, and the mess hall served food that tasted like food rather than medicine. I walked the corridors as if they were a different station entirely. Helmets sat open on benches, visors removed, the insides wiped clean with a care I had not seen before. Soldiers ran fingers along the seams not in vanity but in respect for what had failed and for what might fail again. In their glances toward me there was gratitude without the weight of worship, and I was thankful for that. Worship makes a person into a symbol, and symbols are brittle. Varric called a debrief that afternoon, not in the command amphitheater but in a maintenance bay where the lights were honest and the floor carried the scuffs of real work. Hox and Lynn stood at my sides like bookends carved by the same hand. The room settled as Varric began, his voice still and precise. He spoke of the sequence at the refinery, the way the tower had grown silent, the gap that silence created. He described the shot at the Queen without embellishment, the way ichor had bloomed like frost, and the visor had remembered it was only a promise made by material and not an oath sworn by truth. When he finished, he looked at me and asked what I would change. I told him we could not rely on miracle shots or a single inventor with a handful of improvised rounds. I said we needed to teach the army to hear the battlefield. If every squad could find a strut or a plate and turn it into an instrument, we could force the Hive into constant adaptation. He nodded and said, "Then we will teach them." Training shifted overnight. The range did not become easier, but it became different. Plates were mounted at odd angles and ducts were opened to let air sing. Instructors taught recruits to listen for tones and feel for tremors. Soldiers closed their eyes and tapped walls lightly, learning to translate vibration into knowledge. I walked those sessions quietly with Lynn, who could already hear a map in the hum of power conduits, and with Hawks, who learned to step softly for a giant until the floor stopped complaining. Laughter returned in the edges of the day, but it had changed shape. It was the sound of teams becoming teams rather than the bark of mockery. When mischief reappeared, it was kinder. Someone left a cup on my bunk that read Museum Peace, and the coffee inside it was the best I had tasted since leaving Earth. Keln did not attend the new training at first. His pride kept him in the simulator rooms where gravity obeyed him and others had to watch. The sabotage was an unspoken stone between us that others stepped around out of politeness or fear. Varric did not step around it. He spoke to Keln in the open, his voice measured, his questions simple. Keln denied it with the smoothness of practice. Evidence arrived anyway, the kind of evidence that does not shout but simply stands in the light until lies look embarrassed. Supply logs, surveillance of a hand where it should not have been, the hollow shells I had turned over after the battle tagged with trace residue from his unit. Varric did not strip him of rank in public, or feed the gossip mill. He did something quieter and more effective. He assigned Keln to my training cadre for remedial instruction in resonance tactics. The first day Keln stared at me as if I were a punishment. By the end of the week he stared at the floor when I asked him to listen and tell me what it was saying. He failed, then failed better, and when he finally heard the faint note of a beam ready to sing, his mouth opened in reluctant wonder. The apology he offered later was not poetic, just a nod held a second longer than necessary, and that was enough. The engineers built prototypes in parallel, small devices that could be clipped to rifles to guide ricochet paths and amplify the frequencies that mattered. They asked me to test them, and I did, offering notes in the plain language of a person who has learned that simplicity travels farther than cleverness. Some prototypes sang bright and true. Others choked on their own ambition. We kept what worked and retired what did not without grief. Meanwhile I refined the hybrid rounds, this time with supervision and safety protocols and a proper lab that smelled of solvent rather than panic. We learned to control the spread of ichor so that the round wounded rather than sprayed indiscriminately. Hawks named the new rounds bells because they wanted to be rung. Lynn called them seeds because they grew into cracks. Both names were true enough to keep.